Enroll your child for the manifested e-learning platform and see their grades grow tremendously. These videos can be downloaded to a laptop for offline viewing or viewed from a smartphone in a cost-friendly format.
Welcome, dear learner, to Manifested e-learning. Today we are going to have a history and government lesson. We are having a history and government lesson, and it's a continuation of the topic that we have been looking at, the topic introduction to history and government. That is the topic that we have been looking at. And in our previous lesson, we were looking at the sources of information. Sources of information to history and government. To history and government. So remember, we are looking at the unwritten sources of information to history and government, because we gave three categories of sources of information. We said, number one, we have unwritten sources, written sources, and electronic sources. So we are looking at unwritten sources of information, unwritten sources of information. And we said, under the unwritten sources of information, we have one, we have oral traditions. Then two, what did we look at as our second source of unwritten sources? We looked at linguistics. Then number three, what did we look at as our number three source of information? What did we look at, dear learners? We looked at archaeology. And then number four, which we are going to look at today, we are going to look at anthropology. And then we look at genetics as a source of information. So you can remember we have already looked at oral traditions. We said it is the information that is passed from one generation to the other by word of mouth. Linguistics, we said it is the scientific study of languages, right? And then we looked at archaeology, which is the scientific study of human or the scientific study of past or of remains, material remains of human activities, right? We looked at artifacts, we looked at fossils. We also looked at the different ways of establishing an archaeological site or where somebody can find these remains. So today, my dear learner, we are going to look at anthropology as our fourth unwritten source. Remember, it is unwritten source. So we are going to look at anthropology as our fourth source of unwritten, as our fourth source of unwritten source of information. So what is anthropology? So when you talk of anthropology, it is the study of peoples way of life. It is the scientific or the scientific study of people's way of life. Their origin, where they originated, where did they come from, their origin, customs, and beliefs. It is the study of people's way of life, that is their origin, their customs, and beliefs. So in this place, the scientist studying anthropology will look at the people's way of life. The scientist will go where the people live. He will interact with them. He will observe. He becomes part of that community or that people who are being studied. So if, for example, I want to know what are the customs and beliefs of the Marakwet, for example, among the Marakwet, I will go out, start living among the Marakwet, right? Know what they believe in, observe how they do their activities. At what time do they wake up? How do they pray, right? How do they interact? How do women interact with men? How do children interact with the elders? I'll become, or that is a branch, or that is a source, or that is another source of information concerning history and government. So by observing, a scientist will be able to know, wow, these are the practices of this community. These are the practices of this group of people. It doesn't have to be a community. For example, you might want to know about the street children. A scientist will behave like us. He will go to the street families, right, to know what they go through. That is a source of information. So the scientist will go interact with them. So as the activities are happening, so you will be able to know where did they come from, how did they end up where they are. That is the origin. What do they do on their daily, day-to-day life? What are their customs, right? When a child is born, for example, what do they do? What are the activities they do, right? What are their beliefs? Do they believe in a supernatural being? That is a question you will answer by observing and partaking. You have to become a part of that community. So that involves a scientist living their own life. As a scientist, you don't exist as your own, with your own culture. You have to adapt to the culture of the people that you are studying. That is anthropology. So this kind of getting information, do you think it has advantages of getting information through anthropology? What are some of these advantages? So you can discuss. You can try and scribble down. What are some of these? What do you think are the advantages of one, or the advantages of information you might get by a scientist living or interacting with the audience, or with the society, or with the person in whom he wants to get information? What do you think are the advantages of using such kind of a source? So what are the advantages of using such kind of a source? So let us look at that. The advantages of using anthropology. What are the advantages of using anthropology as a source of information? So number one, it enables scientists, or it gives information about the origin and development of a people. So by the scientists being involved or interacting with the people on their day-to-day life, A scientist is able to know where did these people come from, what do they believe in, how have they come to be where they are today. And then number 2, information is easily obtained. Information is easily obtained. Information is easily obtained. What does that mean? As a scientist, you just need to sit down and observe the people. If they are dancing, you can go around, you dance with them. So you just observe and make conclusions or deductions, or you can deduce, right, from what the people are doing. You do not have to ask a question. By just observing, then you know this is how these people interact and these are their activities. So, and then number 3, it complements. It complements other sources of information. Yes, for example, an anthropologist can very easily interact with a linguist, a person who is studying languages, right? Because as you study a person's culture and belief system, you need to understand their language, right? So the linguists will be able to interact with the anthropologists. That is complementation. They work hand in hand, right? So that is another advantage of using anthropology. So let us look at the disadvantages. Let us look at the disadvantages of using anthropology as a source of information. The first one, that is the most obvious one, it is very expensive. It is very expensive. Why? The scientist has to move from their own land to come and interact with the group being studied. If you are the one who is the scientist, for example, you study and then you become an anthropologist, you want to be studying communities, you have to leave your family, your own family, and you have to go and live among other people. When you go to live there, it does not mean you just be having food for free. You have to pay for that food, right? You have to entice them so that they can accept you in their culture and in their families, right? So that is one disadvantage. And then number 2, people may behave differently. People may behave differently in the presence. Strangers. So if you are a visitor, even in your home, right? Whenever there are visitors coming to your home, right? You do not behave normally. For example, if you know as a visitor is coming to visit you tomorrow, what will you do? You will want to clean the house. You will want to make sure the things are well arranged. That is not the normal way in which your house is always, right? So whenever there is a stranger, people will want to behave differently. They'll want to show the better or the conducive image. They not want to show their real image. And then number 3, the next disadvantage, it is time consuming. It is time consuming. It will take you a lot of time for you to understand how people behave. For example, if you want to study how initiation rites are carried out in a specific community, it means you have to wait or you have to stay for a very long time during the initiation period, right? Some may take long, others may wait for, some happens after every 2 years. Or for example, if you are among the Kalenjin, you are studying such a community, initiation rites happen only after 5 years. So it will take you just observe for the first time, for the first time. If for you want to confirm something else, you have to wait for another 5 years. So that might take a very long time. So it is time consuming for you to get information. And then lastly, number 4, the researcher may make wrong conclusions, right? The researcher may make wrong conclusions, because we have said a researcher is able to observe. You just observe and make a conclusion. So you might be, because you make a conclusion based on your own experience or on your own knowledge. So as you make a conclusion, you might mistake a very normal occurrence to be something weird or something that is wrong, right? So as a researcher, as you make conclusions, there is a risk of you making the wrong conclusion. So let us, my dear learners, look at now the last, right? So we have looked at the anthropology. So let us look at the last part, or the last source, which is what? Genetics. So that is our last source that we are going to look at, genetics. So what is genetics? Genetics is the study. So that is our number 5, right? Do not forget that. It's our 5th unwritten source of information. So what is genetics? So when you talk of genetics, we are talking, or we refer to that as the scientific study. It is the scientific study of how characteristics are passed on from parents to their offspring. So it is a scientific study of how a characteristic of a parent is passed on to the offspring. That is genetics. So as creatures, both animals and plants, you'll find that an offspring, or the offspring will get specific characteristics or traits, right? A characteristic can also be referred to as a trait. You will find a trait, right, which is also a characteristic that is passed on from the parent, right, to the offspring. Let's use an example of a human being. You might find that the parents of the parents, let's use of a person, you find that they are light skinned and they are tall, like myself, right? You will find you are light skinned or tall. Then the mother is light skinned and tall. The father is light skinned and tall. You do not expect the offspring of those two to be dark, right? To be dark and short, because the characteristics of the parent have to be passed on to the offspring. The same way, even in plants, you might find plants producing different kind of flowers. So if you find a plant that is yellow, for example, or produces flowers that are yellow, the offspring of that plant, you expect them to find or to produce yellow flowers, right? So the study of this inheritance and how different characteristics are inherited, there might be differences, right? What happens if, for example, you are studying a plant that after pollination, as you learned in your science, you find that instead of having yellow flowers, you find it is producing yellow and white flowers. So that is now what the genetics is all about, the study of the characteristics, how these different characteristics are passed on from the parents to the offspring. So how there is that differentiation is what is important right? That information, how these characteristics are inherited or how they are not inherited, brings now, or that is what is important to the scientist. So you are able to know if, for example, somebody has moved from North Africa and settled in the East African area, you'll find that there are traits of parents in West Africa being brought in East Africa. A very good example is what we have in the USA. You find we have the Americans of African descent living in America. How did that happen? Right? So that is studied through genetics. How come we have dark people living in America? Right? So you have to track now the movement of that, of those people, and how the parents have interacted to make, or to bring the conclusion, or to bring to the fact that you will find dark people living in the Americas, right? So that is genetics. So what are the advantages of using this method of source? Advantages of using genetics as a source of information, right? So the first one, information is accurate. Information is accurate. Remember, we are talking of scientific. So there are experiments that are carried out to confirm that whatever is being studied is real. So information is accurate. So the animals or the plants being studied, right? There is evidence. There are experiments that have been carried out. So the information that is gotten from genetics, it is very accurate. And then number two, it enables tracing of origins. It enables tracing of origins of animals and plants. As the example I've given you about the black Americans, right? So you can explain the existence of black people in America through genetics by simply saying there are people who moved into the Africans who are moved into the America during the transatlantic trade, and now they intermarried with the native people of America to bring the black American race that we have in America. So it helps us to trace. So you are able to trace. If you test the characteristics, you are even able to trace from where did these black American originate from in Africa. Was it from North Africa or West Africa or even East Africa? By testing and comparing different characteristics. I'm sure you will discuss that more when you are talking in biology, or those of you after this whom we will want to specialize in that place as a scientist, you will get more information. And then the next advantage, it complements other sources. So genetics acts to help or fill in the gaps, right, that the other sources are unable to give us, right? So we can also look at the disadvantages. So number one, the most obvious one, it is expensive, because for you to study traits, that means you have to get samples of these plants, samples of these animals, and requires laboratories and such things. So it is expensive compared to, and remember, you have to compare. You do not just say it is expensive. You have to compare it with another one. It is expensive compared to, for example, oral traditions, which just require you to learn a song, to learn a language, right? To learn a riddle, right? So it is expensive. And then number two, it requires expert knowledge. It requires expert knowledge. Without you having the knowledge of the characteristics that are inherent in an animal or a plant, it becomes very possible for you to interpret information gotten from genetics. And then lastly, it is time consuming. It is time consuming. It requires you to make a study. You have to get samples, put them in a laboratory, wait for you to get results. When you get results, you have to match them with other experiments that you have made. That requires a lot of time because you cannot just do it all of a sudden and then you make conclusions. So for you to make a good scientific argument, it requires you to take a lot of time testing different samples and making varied conclusions. Are you together, my dear learner? So that is all about genetics. We have said genetics is the study of how characteristics are passed on from the parent to the offspring, right? So those are now, I'm sure you are able to explain the unwritten sources of information to history and government. And we have discussed all the 5 of them. We have said there is unwritten source, which is oral traditions, linguistics, archaeology, anthropology, and genetics. Yes, so my dear learner, we have come to the end of today's lesson. But before we end the lesson, I want to give you a very brief exercise that you have to try at home. And please do not check on your notes, right? Yeah, try and answer without checking on the notes, and then you can confirm from what you have noted down. So a revision question. A revision question. A revision question. So this is actually, let me give you 2 questions, revision questions. So the first question that you should attempt: discuss the advantages and disadvantages of anthropology as a source of information. And then number 2, identify the shortcomings of genetics as a source of information. Identify the shortcomings of genetics as a source of information to history and government. And with that, my dear learner, I'm sure you are able to discuss all these things. We have discussed all of them. The unwritten sources of information. We said they are 5 in number: oral traditions, linguistics, archaeology, and anthropology, and genetics. And in our today's lesson, we have discussed anthropology and what? Genetics. So, my dear learner, can you attempt these questions on your notebook without even looking at what you have been studying? Just try to remember, and then if you have forgotten, you can go back and confirm from the notes that you have just taken down. So that brings us to the end of our lesson today. I wish you all the best. Bye bye.